Hello, welcome to Beans, the Magical Fruit. This wheelbarrow series class, we're going to concentrate on growing beans in Kentucky. This is not a real long PowerPoint because beans are not really that difficult to grow as long as you provide them a few things that we're going to talk about. But you could run into some problems, so it's well worth taking a look at this PowerPoint if you're not very familiar with growing beans, where you can be successful. We'll start with a few bean bits. The botanical name for beans is Phaseolus. Phaseolus vulgaris is the common bean, which is the green bean, the pinto bean, and those kinds of beans that you're probably pretty familiar with. The lunatus are the lima beans, and then it goes on from there with the cowpeas and the other types of beans for different botanical names. But all of them are Phaseolus. The beans belong to the same botanical family as peas, peanuts, and alfalfa. These are all known as legumes. There are even trees like locusts that are considered legumes. They've been cultivated since the 7th millennium BC. That is pretty far back if you want to think about that. That's 7,000 years before Christ. They've been grown as human and animal food, as plants, pods, and beans. They are an important source of protein in the Old and the New World. Without beans, most vegetarians would really have a hard time getting their protein. So these do provide a lot of protein, and they do supplement protein in people's diets that maybe you can't eat um, animal products. Some more bean bits. Over 4,000 cultivars of beans are in the United States alone. Some of you probably see the 15 bean soup that they sell, and you think, oh my gosh, I can't imagine there being 15 beans, but there's about 4,000 cultivars. They were found growing in large fields by Columbus, which for the most part were the types eaten fresh today. A lot of these older varieties have not changed a lot from the time Columbus was here. A lot of these varieties settled into closed selections as the Native Americans saved seeds from particular plants, and there were cultivars that were grown all over this country by the Native Americans that may have been only grown by that particular tribe. You can see in the picture here, this is called the Three Sisters. This was one of the ways that the Native Americans would have planted beans and squash and corn. If you think about it, back then, most of the beans probably were vining crops. So they would plant these three together with the beans, the corn, and the squash. The squash would ramble on the ground. The beans would ramble up the corn stalks. And with that, the beans, if you didn't know, legumes can fix their own nitrogen. So when they fix their own nitrogen, they make that nitrogen available to the corn and to the squash. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the three there. And you've got to think about it this way: back then, the corn was grown for using as a meal or to make tortillas and those kinds of things, not necessarily the sweet corn that we may think about today of eating. It was mostly dried corn. So by the time that all of these three plants were finished, they had dried beans, dried corn, and then they had the squash on the ground that they could pick, and then they could store that later into the winter. The nutritional information for beans, they're very nutritious. About a half a cup provides 6 to 8 grams of fiber. That's about 35% of your recommended daily allowance, and 7 grams of protein. Also, a half a cup serving equals 1 ounce serving of lean meat in the meat group and one full serving in the vegetable group. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone there by eating beans. A half a cup serving contains large amounts of iron, phosphorus, magnesium, manganese, potassium, copper, calcium, and zinc. So you can see this is a rich food source for us, and that's the reason beans have been grown for so long in human culture. Beans, like most vegetable crops, prefer full sun and well-drained soil. Different varieties prefer different temperatures. More on that later. You probably should do a soil test. I shouldn't say probably. You're always going to hear that from the extension agent. But they're free in Washington County if you're from Washington County, so there's no reason, or if you own land in Washington County, there's no reason not to get that done. As far as more on that later, for the most part, there's only one bean that is not native to the Western Hemisphere. Um, that would be the fava bean, and that is a cool season bean. But then we have peas and those other things that are cool season as well. But most of the bean varieties are native to the Western Hemisphere. As far as culture, beans do prefer a pH in the 6.2 to 6.8 range, which is slightly acidic. Your soil test will tell you if you need phosphorus or potassium. That's why we tell you to do a soil test. 25 pounds per 1,000 square feet of 10-10-10 if you don't do a soil test. You can see the little chart there to the left. It's from one of UK's publications on growing vegetables at home. And if you get a soil test done, you can see it'll tell you if it's above 60 for phosphorus or 300 on potash. It'll tell you 0 to 1 pound per 1,000 square feet of actual nutrients there. Most of the time, if it's above those, we're going to tell you there's no reason to apply nitrogen or apply phosphorus and potassium. Now, as far as beans, beans do fix their own nitrogen, and for the most part, we don't need to add nitrogen. We do at a particular time. It may help a little bit increase your production. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But go ahead and just apply a well-rounded fertilizer. If it tells you you need a pound of phosphorus, a pound of potassium, go ahead and just use a 10-10-10 or a triple 19 or something like that to meet those requirements. That extra nitrogen is sure not going to hurt the other plants in the garden. They're not going to hurt the beans either. They're going to grow quite well with that. As far as variety, there's a multitude of variety of beans out there, and these are just a few pictures of different types of beans. There's dried beans, there's green beans, there's purple potted, green potted, yellow potted. Um, just a multitude of different types out there. Speckled seeds, speckled pods. Some have purple flowers, some have white flowers. You can see there's just so much variety out there on these that it's quite interesting to grow a lot of these. And it's quite interesting to grow some of these different varieties that maybe you've never grown before or heard of. The flavors, if you've liked beans on some of these heirlooms, is just absolutely phenomenal. Beans have three types of growth habits in the garden. We have the pole bean, which is pictured here. This is the original eating beans. Most beans were vines until they were selected down to be bush. Generally, they grow 6 feet or more. They have to have a trellis or some kind of support to grow on, or they're going to sprawl over the ground, and then your pods are not going to be nice to eat. You have other problems then. They do produce over a long season, and also these produce over a long season, and they'll outproduce the bush beans because they have so much more surface area to have bean production. And these will keep producing quite a bit longer than your bush beans will, because the bush beans kind of are determinate, like some of the determinate tomatoes where they produce and then they just die. Also, these will produce all the way to the tips of the plants, so you're going to have to pick multiple times, more than twice. A lot of times we pick bush beans twice and then pull them up. But these you may have to pick 4, 5, 6 times over a longer period. Another thing with these is you can get a lot more production out of a smaller space when you grow these, because you're growing vertically and it doesn't take as much actual surface space in your garden. Another type is the bush bean. This is a recent introduction, and recent we mean in the last maybe 100 years. These are what we call the determinate type, where they produce and then the plant dies. Um, these produce full crop generally within 2 pickings, which means they're done after that. I have gotten 3 before out of some time on a really, really good year, but for the most part, 2 pickings is about all they're really worth going over. They are easier to get large amounts for sales quickly this way because they are quick growing crops. They are harder to pick for some homeowners because you have to get down on the ground. But you can sit down on a bucket or something to pick, whereas on the pole beans you've got to kind of get up under and stoop under the plant to get the beans out. You can get several plantings from this from one season as well. We'll talk about the beans that you're going to try at home, how many days and from planting until harvest. Another great thing is for these you don't need a trellis. A lot of times some kind of trellis to put up pole beans can be quite tricky, and then you run the risk of wind, storms and things blowing those over, which can create a mess. Trust me, been there, done that. So these are just easy. These also come in many varieties, just like the pole beans do. There's probably more on the market varieties of bush beans now than pole beans, just because of the ease of production. These are also easy for mechanical harvest and for seed harvest as well. Then we have the half runners. There's a few types of half runners out there. This growth habit is kind of between bush and pole. These can be heavy yielders, but some support increases your production. If you let them kind of sprawl all over the garden, they kind of grow 3 feet, 4 feet out, and it just can become messy and kind of hard to pick if you don't have a little bit of support. This is some of the original low string beans, where some of the stringless characteristics came from these to that were bred into some of the bush beans. There's not very many varieties of these. The white half runner is probably the one that most people are familiar with, and a lot of people still grow because their grandparents grew those, because these were the original stringless beans, we should say, or low string beans. These are still very popular. So they have a really good flavor as well. They're just kind of intermediate growth habit there. If you just want to put a short trellis up, this is great. Something like a 3 or 4 foot tall fence or panel or something like that works just fine for these. So if you look at the map here, we got the average day of the last killing frost, which is 36 degrees in the spring. This comes from UK, their vegetable publication. You can see where we live there in that white. It's anywhere from April 30th to May 5th. That coincides with most of us being able to plant frost-sensitive plants after Derby Day. Derby Day generally is the first Saturday in May. Obviously, this season, Derby Day is going to be in September because of the COVID-19. However, these dates still hold pretty firmly for us. Some years you can plant earlier and get by with it. Some years you might plant right on that date and still have to check on frost. But this is your seeding date that you can put these plants in. These are very frost sensitive, so if we do have any kind of low temperatures, you're going to have to cover these if you plant them any earlier than that. If you look down the table 4 there, this is a vegetable planting guide to plant vegetables the right way. If you see bush or lima beans there, it tells you number of transplants or seeds per foot. It's per foot of row, so 6 to 8 seeds. And then the distance between the plants when thinned is 4 to 5, and the distance between the rows is 30 inches. And your planting depth is about 1.5 inches. That's for bush and lima beans, but we have the snap beans. You can put them a little closer together there, as you can see. The plants are not quite as robust on those. So here's another chart. It tells you when you should plant, and this is an early planting date and a late planting date. We can get multiple crops of especially bush beans or snap beans, if you want to call them that, green beans, whatever, in Kentucky, and you got western, central, and eastern when our safe dates are. So for snap beans in Kentucky, you can see the chart there. For central Kentucky is April the 25th, so you can seed them then. You got a week or so till they germinate. They get you up to that frost date. And then you got the latest planting there in the central is July the 25th. And that's just the safe dates. That doesn't mean that there may be years you can go outside of that and be just fine, but those are the safe dates. I have planted snap beans as late as August the 15th and still had a pretty good harvest, but that's pushing the envelope. Last year you probably would have been just fine because it was so hot so long up into the fall. The beans grew quite well, and you probably could have gotten even a little later planting date than that. But generally speaking, as those days get cooler and shorter, the beans slow down, and it just takes a lot longer for those to mature in the fall. So how much should you plant? We get these questions a lot, and also in the vegetable publication from UK, we have a chart that tells you how much to plant based on per person, and then based on whether you want to freeze or can, or how much you can expect in 100 feet of row. So if you look down there on that chart, as far as snap bush beans, 100 feet of row, you can expect 120 pounds of beans. That's the pods. That's still a lot of beans. 100 foot of row is a pretty long row of beans, however. So if you go over next, the approximate planting per person. So if you want it just for fresh eating, about 15 to 16 feet is enough per person. But if you want to can them, you can go 15 to 20 feet. Um, you can also freeze green beans. Some people like that. I'm not a fan of them. I think they're too mushy after they're cooked. But you know what? If that's what you like, by all means. But so it seems odd. I know that says 15 to 16 for fresh, but 15 to 20 for storage or freezing. I would probably up that second part there because I'd rather have too many green beans to freeze than not enough. So as far as fertilizing, there's different times that different crops will need a little extra nitrogen. Beans are not that picky about their nitrogen because they have the ability to set nitrogen or to fix nitrogen to the root systems. However, there is a time to increase your production. It's after heavy blossom instead of pods. So as soon as you notice you have a lot of blooms, you got these little beans starting on there. If you increase that nitrogen just a little bit, you're going to increase the production or the size of those pods, which is what we're wanting if you're eating green beans, and the size of the pods. Also, if you're doing dry beans, because the bigger the pod, the more beans is going to be in there that you're going to harvest later on. So you can see there, general rate for side dressing is 5 tablespoons of ammonium nitrate per 10 feet of row. Ammonium nitrate's not really easy to find anymore. So if you think of ammonium nitrate as being a third, it's 30% nitrogen. Urea is what you're going to find now is 46%. You can knock that down to 3.5 to 4 tablespoons instead of 5, and you'd be right in that area to add that little extra nitrogen to your beans. For optimum growth, your vegetables, most vegetables and most plants that we grow need about an inch of water per week. I say however because you definitely need that water whenever those the plant's blooming and those pods are setting and growing. Beans can sit there really when they're young and be dry, be quite fine, and just kind of hang out until they start to get rain. But once those beans start to form on that plant and it's in bloom, it has to have that water to make a nice bean. And also, dry weather beans will make them more likely to be stringy. Even if you have the stringless types, they can become tough, and you can still develop some strings in these. So that's whenever you definitely have to have water. So that's that critical time in there is pollination and pod development. This is another little chart. It just tells you the types of insects that you could find on your beans. And you can look down through there, and a lot of those are fairly common. You'll find these on a lot of different plants. We have aphids, bean leaf beetles. Flea beetles are going to be one that's going to be really big probably for most people, especially if you're in a place where you've been growing vegetables before. Bean beetles, some years can be devastating, and some years you don't see them at all. But those are something to keep a lookout on. Seed maggots are one of those that worry me, especially if you're growing in an area where there was sod last year, or if we have a cool, wet spring after these are planted, because the seed maggots are the little fly will come down and they'll lay an egg next to your seed or right at your seed, and whenever that little egg hatches, that little maggot will crawl into your seed and eat it, and it'll rot and it'll die. So those could be really bad some years not. If you know you're in an area that might have those, you can go ahead and put your seeds down your row. Go ahead and spray some insecticide over that. I would probably do malathion just because it's easy and cheap to get, but you could do it other ones as well. Um, Sevin might work. I think malathion's probably a little better for some of those flies. But you know, something like that is up to you. Um, you may be fine, but you may end up planting beans more than one time, especially if you want an early planting. Once we get up into hot weather, the beans usually germinate and pop out of the ground pretty quick, so we don't have as much chance of that happening. Another thing, if you look on this chart, say we have aphids on our beans, it gives you a number there, and you can coincide with that with the number next to that, and it'll give you the insecticides that are good for those. We've got malathion, pyrethrins, um, insecticidal soaps, and then neem oil. Um, anyway, you just pick your battle there. Some of these are, I think, rotenone may be considered um, organic, but for the most part, most of these are not. Insecticidal soaps would be, and neem would be. Um, but it depends on the insect that you have, whether any, if those will actually even work on the plants you're growing. Just a few of the pests these are the ones you're more likely to see in any given year. The first one there on the left, the little black flea beetles, those are about the size of an actual flea that's really blown up, but they will make little poked holes in your plant, and you'll see them all over, and over time they can actually really reduce your harvest because they've taken so much little pieces of leaf and tissue out. And then we have the aphids there, the next one over in the middle. Aphids have sucking mouth parts, so they actually drink fluid out of the plant. So over time, they can really reduce your growth as well because the plant can't keep up with the amount of fluid and sugars those aphids are taking out. Just below that is the Japanese beetle. That's another one of those that could be hit or miss. I will say I have had a lot more trouble with Japanese beetles on pole beans than on bush beans. I guess being taller and up in the air, it's just easier for them to fly into it. They feel safer up there, and you'll get those in a lot higher concentrations on those pole beans. The next one there is a tarnished plant bug. That one you see every once in a while. It's not that common. And then down on the lower left, that is the bean beetle. You can see the little speckled beetle there, kind of look like a ladybug, and some people sometimes confuse them with that and leave them. And then you see these larger little cottony yellow-looking larvae. They do a lot of damage and a lot of feeding, and then in that picture you can even see the eggs there. This one, if you do start to have an outbreak, you want to go ahead and get those under control because they can kind of ramp up and defoliate plants pretty quick. You can also see a few disease problems on beans. Usually, these are, especially this first one, anthracnose, is usually going to be on a wet year. But for control, you want to use disease-free seed. That's always a must. Buy seeds from a reputable dealer. However, some people do save their own seeds, but if you had anthracnose last year and you saved seeds from these pods that may have had these spots on it, you have a good chance of carrying that disease over to your plants for the next year. So you don't want to save seeds on pods that are diseased like that. As soon as you see those spots, you can go ahead and apply chlorothalonil at first sight of disease, and again 7 to 10 day intervals. Chlorothalonil is one of those all-around fungicides that we use in vegetables and ornamentals. It actually just kills spores on contact, so kind of reduces the number of spores there. Once something's infected, though, it can't stop that infection. It can just help stop the infection from spreading to other parts of the plant. Another great thing, or big thing, is don't work the plants while wet because then you're moving those fungal spores around, and you don't want to do that. The next one down is bacterial blight. That one is not that common either, but if you do get it, it can be quite devastating. Again, use disease-free seed. Avoid saving seeds, again, from diseased plants because those bacteria will overwinter on those seeds in storage. And if you do have a severe outbreak and you see those little speckles on the leaves there, you can use fixed copper, which would be an organic control. And what it'll do is it'll help stop the spread because the copper actually inhibits bacterial growth. And then the last one down there is rust. Another one of those. They can be hit or miss, but in a particular situation can be really bad. You want to use resistant varieties down there, whereas we don't have any resistant varieties really for the top two. I shouldn't say we don't. Not quite as good a resistance as we do on the rust ones. And then you can apply chlorothalonil for the rust at first sight every 7 to 10 days. You probably won't see more than one of these in a year. You may not see any of them in some years. It just depends on the year. A wet year, you're more likely to see any of these, but especially the anthracnose. You can get a few viruses in beans as well, and you can see the different leaves, how they're shaped there. A lot of these you'll see one plant in your row or one plant in your field. Nothing to really worry about. If you get a whole row of it, then you might have a problem, but a plant here and there is not that big a deal. And if you're not saving seeds, it doesn't matter to you anyway. But to control that, you again want to use disease-free seed. If you're going to save seed, don't save seed out of a plant that has leaves or stunted looking like that, the larger green picture there. Avoid planting near other legumes such as alfalfas, clovers, those types of things. The reason is these viruses can be moved around from aphids and stuff, and even mechanically by you from plant to plant. So if you're close by a large soybean field or alfalfa field and you plant bush beans there, you've got a much higher chance of some of these viruses popping up in your garden. And then again, you can also use resistant varieties, and we'll go over a few varieties here in a minute and see what maybe would be a best option there. For the most part, you might see one or two plants with these in your garden, and if you plant, fairly large a garden, you may see a few more, but they're not really something I'm that concerned about. So, what are you going to try at home? This is Dulcina Romano bean. A lot of you all are familiar with the Roma bean, the flat-potted Italian type bean. This is another version of that. You can read there, it has a very fleshy 6-inch to 7-inch long pod. They are stringless and they taste really well. They can be eaten fresh, frozen, or canned. You can slice the pods in the traditional way or in chunks. I would call that just break the beans, if you will. It's totally up to you. These are really good bean there, really nice variety of Italian flat-potted bean. Then we have Ferrari French fillet. Filet beans, if you've ever had a French bean fillet, they kind of cut those in long strips. These French filet beans are really thin beans to start with. This one produces very high yields of slender, straight, round, medium green pods. It's also stringless, has a really nice flavor. You can freeze these or can these. Just because it says a French filet bean or whatever, they're still a green bean. They're still a snap bean. You can still can those and do whatever you like with these. If you like a really thin bean, though, this is a really nice one. I know some people like the fatter pods, some people like the thinner pods. So it's totally the preference for whoever, whatever preference you have. These beans have a good shelf life, and they're really nice served fresh. So you can pick these, put these in a plastic grocery bag, kind of wrap it over and put it in the crisper in the refrigerator, and they'll keep a little longer than some of the other varieties will. These also has a really good disease resistance package. So if you've had some of those disease problems before, if you've grown beans, this plant may be an option for you in those areas. This is goldenrod bush bean. These are called yellow or wax bean. These plants produce bumper crops of 5 to 6-inch pods. The seed develops slowly, therefore you get a lot of pod and less bean in there, and they don't become lumpy. Some people don't like those larger beans in their pods. This one's good for canning, freezing. It's also good for fresh eating. This one is resistant to the common bean mosaic virus, so you don't have to worry about that as much if you're going to have to plant these closer to another field of legumes. You would cook these just like you do your green beans. Also notice that the pods there, the little tips stay green. These kind of are easier to find if you're gonna if you have a hard time finding the green pods in your beans. With these, they're bright yellow. They're easy to see when you go out and pick those. So it's kind of like a neon sign. Like, here's the bean, come and pick me. This is Jade 2. This is the second version of Jade. It is a really dark green, almost jade color bean. I've grown this one several times before. It's a delicious bean. It's also a really good bean, a really pretty bean, I guess you would say, when canned in the jar. It keeps a really dark color, a really nice color, I should say. Has really long 6 to 7-inch pods. Really nice color again. Very vigorous. A good upright plant. Keeps the pods straight, keeps the pods up off the ground. So if you've had a lot of rain and worry about splashing soil on those pods, a lot of us have grown beans before, and those pods are really dirty, so you have a lot of washing to do before you can eat these, before you can break them. These produce for a long time as well. This is one of those I got 3 pickings off of one year as a bush bean. So again, this has really good yield, and it even produces on dry years or really hot, stressful years. So I hope that you'll try this one. It's really nice. If you like the can, you're going to like the color of this one in the jar. So a lot of you don't think about the cow peas or the black-eyed peas, the purple-eyed peas, whatever you want to call it, as being beans, but they are. This is Mississippi silver cowpea. It's hard for me to say. And you can see there 64 days. We talked about this earlier. Let me back up. Well, I can't back up right now, but on these, the 64 days is from the time that you plant it to the time you picked it. This is really a uniform maturing plant. The pods are set at foliage level above the vine, so they're easy to pick, easy to shell and pick. You can let these dry all the way out, or you can let these the pods color up and then pick them as more of a fresh pea. It's totally up to you. I usually let these dry out and then pick them. That way they're easy to store. Then we have quick pick cowpea. This is more of what we would call a purple eye pea. As you can see the little eye on the pea there. This one is a really good for a home garden. It has 8-inch purple pods that are easy to harvest. The pink eye peas are excellent for drying and canning. The pod again is set highly concentrated up on the plant, which makes for easy harvesting. And these pods do turn kind of a dark purple whenever they're filling out. And then they finally will turn that more of a, you can see one of those pods over there, more of a brown whenever they're completely dried out. Rattlesnake pole bean. This is one of my favorite pole beans and actually one of my favorite beans. It has a really good bean flavor, I should say. As long as you pick these young, you won't have to worry too much about strings. If you've grown some other pole beans, let's say Kentucky Wonder and some of those, they get stringy pretty easily, in my opinion. These are a much better version. These produce long 7-inch beans. And they are streaked with these purple streaks on there, which I think is ornamental. It also has a purple flower, which is also ornamental. This one does very well in drought situations as well. Again, though, if you let it be droughty on it, you have a higher chance of having strings, and you will have to string them. And if you let them get too big, you'll have to string them. But usually, I'll pick them at that 6-7-inch long bean, and they'll be narrow and nice. Again, one of my favorite eating beans, a really good bean flavor. I will say up front, those purple streaks disappear when cooked, and it's just green in the jar or after it's cooked. Here's a shell bean. This is Vermont cranberry bean. All the beans that you're getting in the class when they come in are from Vermont bean seed catalog. This is their bean of the millennium, which Vermont, you can understand why they call it. But anyway, this is an old-time New England heirloom dating back to the 1700s. It's a really attractive, pretty dried bean. Really reliable. It's really hardy. It's a good shell bean. Useful for fresh. If you want a fresh shell bean or you want to dry them. 60 days fresh, 85 dried. If you're in a short season like in Vermont, they're probably doing a lot of the fresh. But down here, 85 days is no problem for us as far as getting a dried bean. This one is really good flavor. It's good in soups. It makes a really great baked bean. If you like baked beans, you want to make your homemade baked beans, this is a good version for that. And lastly, this one I have not grown. I'm interested to grow it, so I thought we'd throw it in here. This is willow leaf lima bean. You can see 90 days. It's a fine old heirloom, it says. Heat and drought resistant plants. A lot of times we have trouble growing lima beans around here because we have trouble with pod set and those types of things. Usually that's weather related. Our weather fluctuates a lot even in the summer here, so it causes us to have some problems with lima beans as far as them setting pods regularly. This is a heavy yielding compact plant, it says, but what's unique about it is its leaves are more narrow, more willow-like than what we consider to be beans. So it's going to be interesting to grow this one. The pods, it says, are dark green, 3.5 inches long with 3 or 4 creamy white seeds per pod. Especially adapted to the south and warm coastal areas, so we should be just fine for us. 90 days, again, we usually have more than 120 days growing season, so we'll be fine on that. But it'd be interesting to see with that unique leaf shape how this old heirloom will do down here in Kentucky. Well, that's all of our bean talk. If anybody has any questions, they can always ask it on Facebook when I put it up. They can always send an email to me. You can text me. You can call the office. We're still open. Our office number is 859-336-7741. You can also call my cell. It's 859-481-5475. Again, we're open. We can't have people in the office, but we can talk to you on the phone. We can talk to you through the window. We can even come out and talk and socially distance. I can come and look at your plants if you have any problems there as well. So if you have any questions, you can always contact us. We're still here. We're still waiting to open back up like everyone else is, back to regular hours. But we are here. The beans are not here yet. The lilacs from the last class are not here yet. I keep getting emails that they're backlogged because of the amount of orders they have and the amount of manpower they have. I think probably it's a really good sign that the seed catalogs are so back ordered, because that means they've had a lot of people ordering seeds, which I think is going to be good to have an increase in people having home gardens this year. Again, if you have any questions, give me a call. Happy gardening.